Kia ora tātou, nau mai, haere mai. Welcome to our council meeting of Wednesday, 2nd of June, 2021. The year is rolling on, June. Right, if I could just explain that the meeting is being recorded. It will be on our council website. It is also being live streamed on the City Council's YouTube channel. In terms of health and safety with the building for members of the public, in terms of fire and emergency in the unlikely event of an emergency, if you could evacuate to the assembly area in the green signs, and please follow the staff to the clock tower in Te Marae Ahine, the square. In terms of smoking, this is a non-smoking building. And unlike the event of a defibrillator being needed, that's at the front of house, and our toilets in the link span as you came in. Councillors or anybody that's speaking, if you could please just say your name when you go to speak, so it is on the recording. And I'll now start with our first order of business is apologies. I don't have any. It's fine, we'll move through that. In terms of notification of additional items, I don't have any, but I will just mention two things or mention two people actually, just in the last short while that have, who are two residents of our city and region who've had significant things happen. In the 2021 New Year's Honours, Sir Mason Jury was appointed the Order of New Zealand for services to the nation. Now, this is an exceptional honour. It's one of only 20, he's only one of 20 living New Zealanders with this status, and of course he's very well known to us for services to Māori health and whānau ora, public health services in particular. And the other is Dr. Farah Palmer, who on Monday created history by becoming the first ever Deputy Chair of the New Zealand Rugby Union, female Deputy Chair of the New Zealand Rugby Union. And we know her background and her status in the city. So I think it's just worth noting two outstanding individuals that actually come from our own rohi. So just worth noting that. Moving on to number 3, declarations of interest. Are there any? Councillor Denison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In item 8, I note that I'm a council-appointed trustee to the Manawatu Wanganui Regional Disaster Relief Fund, but I don't believe it's going to conflict my decision-making, so I'll participate. Thank you.
Any other declarations? There being none, that's fine. We move now to number 4, which is confirmation of the minutes. And that Council resolves that the minutes of the Council meeting of the 5th of May 2021, Part 1 public, be confirmed as a true and correct record. I'm happy to move those, seconded by the Deputy Mayor. Are there any matters arising from those minutes? Right, there being none, if you could vote, please. And that has passed 16 votes for and none against. Thank you. Right, we now move to our report section. And at number 5 on our order paper is the Cuba Street Stage 2 report on further engagement. And that's on page 13 of our papers. Before we hopefully get the so the officers to speak to this, we need to, this report needs to be lifted off the table. So I'm quite happy to move that, seconded by the Deputy Mayor. Before we vote on that, are there any comments to that? There being none, I'll ask you to vote, please. Okay, we just a bit of technical stuff there. Could you vote, please? Thank you. Passed 16 votes for, none against. Right, we'll now ask the officer, I'm unsure, Robert Van Bentum, or, sorry, Jeff Snedden is going to speak to this. Thank you. No, I work off this. Welcome, Jeff, and Simon.
Thank you very much for being able to present this paper again this morning. I take the report as being read, but there are a few just highlights that I'd like to point out. As directed by the committee, we've undertaken further consultation with the stakeholders and retailers along the section of Cuba Street. This included a public meeting that was ably chaired by His Worship. And we've refined further the design based on the responses that we've had from those stakeholders. So now what we're asking for is approval of the design that's before you to allow us to tender and to go out to construction. So we're happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Right, we've got a couple of questions. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and thank you for the report. Just a few questions around the financials. Looking at 6.3 on page 19. The new, updated budget of around 1.5 million, am I understanding correctly that that is not including the aspects that are to be moved to and added to the Streets for People program? The paper talks about a change of scope and that some of those things that had originally been included in the Cuba Street work would now be instead added to the Streets for People.
The aspect of the work that's going to the Streets for People are the signal changes for Cuba Rangatiki, so that we can tie that into the work that's being done on Rangatiki's section of Streets for People.
Yes, I understand that. So will that mean that there'll be an additional cost to the Streets for People work as a result of that being added to the Streets for People work as opposed to it being in the Cuba Street package?
Most likely.
And how? So I'm trying to get an understanding of the cost of that and whether we'll need to add some additional budget to the Streets for People budgets as a result of that.
Yeah, hi, sorry. Minimal alteration to the budget for Cuba Street in terms of what Streets for People are doing, the alterations that they will make. I think they're going to be a complete alteration of the lights in the curb and channel of that street anyway, so I don't think any major alteration to the budget requirements.
Okay, thanks. And just one further question. The next bullet point down, 6.4, talks about a request for the increased budget will be put through the long-term plan process for consideration, which obviously happens next week. The recommendation that we have, the third recommendation is that Council approves the modified Cuba Street Stage 2 project to proceed to tender. So I'm just wondering in terms of our process, if that's appropriate for us to do both of those things at the same time. We're approving something to go to a tender, but we're also saying that we're going to consider it next week.
Through you, Mr Mayor, the response is the tendering does not sign up council to a contract. It will also inform us exactly how much this is going to cost. At the moment we have a QS estimate, so this information is really valuable, but it does not commit council to actually doing any work on the street if council changes what it would like to do in the long-term plan.
Okay, that's helpful.
I'll
Thank you.
just further to that, I'll just ask the CFO to comment.
Yeah, I mean, I probably don't need to comment now. I think Jeff answered appropriately, the timing of which is pretty good. I think we would definitely confirm that we've got the budget before we sign any contracts for the work.
Good. Councillor Hapeta.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Thank you, Chief and Simon. Just want to unbundle 4.3, just if you could just clarify the 4 stakeholders who held unfavourable views, just unpack that for us about what they were.
Sure. The
Just I think a bit of that's in part 2 as well. Maybe we answer that in part 2.
Okay.
Or I could ask the officers to perhaps summarise without naming people.
Sure. Thank you. There were 4 unfavourable stakeholders to the designs. They were the original 4 unfavourables when we began discussions with stakeholders and showcased the designs that we had to offer. Over the period of, I think it's been more than a year now, of discussions and some minor modifications to those designs, those same 4 stakeholders have not changed that opinion. It's based around an overall parking strategy for the city, which isn't part of my scope. It's also their belief that by narrowing the street, the road corridor itself, and maximising pedestrian utility and amenity, we're slowing the traffic and making things more difficult for drivers, which they were not in favour of. And I wasn't able to alter those opinions with any of the modifications or just discussions I had in terms of the larger goals, the strategy of the of council.
Thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. It's just a question about the design itself. So we've got a diagram, but it's not annotated. But looking at the diagram, if you look at the area outside Briscoe's, I suppose, there's 2 green swathes and a kind of a plain swathe up the middle. Is that pavement, is that footpath with green planting either side?
Sure. The green is either going to be raised gardens, there'll be rain retention areas or rain gardens, or it's going to be planted grass. So if it's green, it's going to be horticultural in nature.
Okay.
Or agricultural in nature.
And then up the centre is the footpath?
Correct, yes.
Okay. So then when you come back towards Tainui Street, in front of the shops there, is that there are some lines there, but is that just indicating a wider footpath than is there currently, with the parking moved out a bit?
Correct, yes.
Yeah.
It's
So
an alteration of the curb line.
Right. So there's no cycle provision there. The cycle provision is as it is for the rest of Cuba Street, where the speeds are slowed and the cyclists take the lane.
They will be on the road, correct, yes.
Okay. Just wanted to be sure I'd got that right. Thank you.
Councillor Dingwell.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and thank you for this report. With this report, can you just clarify what the changes are in this report as opposed to the report that came to us last time before it lay on the table?
I think the major change is the exit from Cuba Street into Rangitikei.
Yeah.
A second lane has been added, so there are now a left and right turn lanes entering Rangitikei. There's been a minor modification of the curb line outside Mr Model's shop, the addition of a loading zone there for the businesses. It was a request from one of the unfavourables to allow for pickups and drop-offs, which we accommodated. I don't believe there are any other major changes, no.
And so is this budget...
Sorry, just through the chair, the left-right turn was already in the last paper, just the last paper that we brought to council that wasn't tabled, the left-right turn was in that paper before so that had already been discussed with stakeholders. The changes since the discussion have been minor changes to the parking.
Changes to the parking. And so... I know, I'm confused too. So with the budget then in 6.3, is the extra budget shortfall due to these changes that we've made since we've spoken to the 4 stakeholders?
I believe the budget changes we're making are around having a complete understanding of the actual cost of the project in real time, as opposed to an understanding of an estimate developed for the 10-year plan 3 years ago.
Okay. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Councillor Beattie.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and thank you for your report. My question is just around the loss of parking. And I know in 5.4 you're talking about mitigation along Tainui Street with the angle parks, but that's not been progressed. So are we looking at progressing that, or?
Yes, I believe we are. We've done further investigations in terms of the configuration of parking, how we can maximise the available spaces. Perhaps we're altering some of the parallel parking to diagonal, to chevron parking. In terms of what that will look like, again, still being investigated, but if we can't completely mitigate the loss of the 5 car parks that we're losing on Cuba Street, we'll come very, very close to that.
Okay, and will there be additional costs above this budget for that as well?
I don't believe so, no. It will be very, very little. We're talking about blacking out the existing parking and putting more paint on the road, so no actual change to the street itself.
Okay, and just to follow on, with the opening of Vocal Point Theatre and all that, there has been quite a pressure on parking around there. So do you think that all those issues have now been resolved on top of this development that we're doing now?
I think one of the issues that was raised early on by the unfavourables and other stakeholders who were still in favour of the designs was the availability of parking in the area. We've done what we can to mitigate that loss, and perhaps we've actually managed to reach a status quo in terms of no loss. But there's a lot of parking available in the area. I've done what I can with the designs. Focal Point would like more parking to be available, but you know, I'm working on Cuba Street. It's 150 metres long, so I've maximised where I can.
Okay, so besides Tainui Street, do you think there's any other areas out there that we could look at further down the track?
There is parking in King and Queen Street. I think maybe we could, as part of the parking strategy, better indicate the availability of spaces throughout the city. Through stage 1, we maximised out the stage 1 Cuba Street. We maximised out the off-street or the surrounding streets off Cuba in terms of chevron parking, the angle parking that Simon mentioned. We're looking at doing it in Tainui. So that section has pretty much been maxed out at the moment for the available on-street parking. But I think, yeah, like I was saying before, I think the parking strategy could give us a real good lead on how we look at a broader parking availability throughout the central city.
Thank you.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Simon. Just a couple questions. One's around the stakeholder engagement here at the sort of final chapter of it, as you will. So were any stakeholders other than business stakeholders invited to have input into the final stages here?
Yes. Beyond the business owners, we also went to the residents. So there are a few residents living above shops in the area. We also talked to Chamber of Commerce, and there was a gentleman who's very much in favour of some military history recognition in the street. I don't believe there were any other major groups, major stakeholders that we encountered, no.
Thanks. So I guess that would be, if I'm hearing right, to summarize, sort of people that had a direct vested interest in the street as opposed to the wider community.
Correct, yes.
Thank you. Just wanted to understand a little bit around the expected timeframes on staging, in terms of when, let's say, best case, we might see Streets for People actually roll into Rangitikei Street.
I would need to go and refer back to the 10-year plan to give you an update of when Rangitikei was going to be on the program. I can't tell you at the moment, but I can come back to you on that.
I guess what I'm trying to understand from that is sort of, you talk about expectations of change in traffic demand over time as we make these modifications, as we bring in speed limits, as we bring in more active parking management possibly, and just trying to understand, I guess, how much of a delay we're actually creating for the sort of final form of this relative to the actual expected changes that we might see in traffic demand over time. Any comment? Sorry, you were taking notes, which is probably, so I can have a go. I can repeat the question if it's helpful.
In terms of the wider scheme of things and Streets for People, I'm not sure. That's more Jeff's line of questioning. In terms of the Cuba Street construction, dependent upon council's progression of this piece of work, I could go out for tender today and have a tender period of 18 working days, which is the mandated minimum, and have a contractor in place by mid to late August doing the work. So actually this calendar year, we could have Cuba Street constructed and finished.
Thanks. Yeah, sorry, I probably need to rephrase my question to try to tease out what I'm wanting to understand here. So let's say hypothetically Rangitikei Street for Streets for People is actually 5 years away, to pick a number. But let's say within the next 12 months, we actually nail the construction in Cuba Street, we actually nail the change in speed limits to, let's say, 30. We actually start within the next year or two a more active parking demand management system in the city. That potentially leaves us with sort of a 3-year gap before our next sort of go at improving the actual infrastructure in the street, where we haven't actually realized the benefits that we could have, because we've sort of said we're not going to do it today. We're going to wait.
Councillor, I think a lot of that's in our decision, in the LTP around the Streets for People. So it's very much you and I and your colleagues can either speed that up or slow that down. It's in the LTP, and I'm sure we're going to deliberate on it. The officers know it's at this stage it was staged. The infrastructure GM would like to comment.
I was just going to say that Cuba Street is a separate. Just remind the councillors that Cuba Street is a separate project to Streets for People. So clearly, it's been sort of decided on separately to Streets for People as an implementation phase. Streets for People will make sure that it weaves in with the timings that we have and the budgets that we have, but Cuba Street isn't part of the Streets for People programme. It's pre that, I think, because of the linkage with the arena and the opportunity to make that a really lovely place to get to the arena from.
All right, thank you. I'll move on. Final question that I had was just around the accommodation of mobility parks. We've had some feedback around sort of mobility parks in the existing upgrade, and just wondered sort of across the breadth of Cuba Street, both the existing upgrade and what's coming online here, what engagement we've had with users of mobility parks and what our response is.
My father's in his 80s and is a user of mobility parks, so he was my benchmark in terms of what he thought. He wanted parks closer to the cafes. Some of the more useful mobility parks would be outside Briscoe's, but it's their parking, not ours. I can make some changes to the configuration as it stands. Again, this is paint on the ground, and there's been some discussions with some of the stakeholders in terms of where they would like loading zones and things. Mobility parks is, of course, also on the table, but things that we can do further along the process as we're doing the construction. So. I don't believe we've altered the number of mobility parks there. I don't believe there's been a loss, but something I can take into account if you've had some requests from the public.
So I guess to be more specific then, in terms of the detail of the design, will you be engaging with the disability reference group around what's needed or other groups?
Absolutely, of course, absolutely.
Right, thank you. Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Finlay. Councillor Hancock.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Look, I just really want to get just a little bit, some clarification just around the stakeholder engagement. Do you get a feel for the flexibility of the stakeholders, you know, the retailers and the business people in that area there in terms of contractor flexibility to try and speed up the project?
Sure. When we go out for tender and we're selecting contractors, we're going to put a significant amount of weight in our evaluation on their methodology, how they're going to approach the construction itself. With stage one, that central part of Cuba Street, it took, I believe, 13 months for the construction to take place. We're looking at a much reduced construction period now. It's much simpler because we've done the deep work already. The water supply and wastewater was done 18 months ago. This should be much quicker. There are some options available, I think, to the contractor to allow traffic through or around that construction site. So we're minimising disruption. If we closed that section of Cuba Street, we could do it faster, of course, but there's going to be a balance between access by traffic, always access by pedestrians, of course, but we're looking to complete this as fast as we can before the Christmas period, before there's more than minimising as much disruption as we can.
If I may just continue. So in terms of the tender process, are we looking to try and get the successful tenderer to be able to be more flexible in terms of the times of day and extending the week to try and speed up this? Because I'm just mindful that with previous Streets for People projects, we've run into a lot of flack around the length of the project and the disruption to business.
Sure. So with my stakeholder engagement, a number of the questions we asked were, how do you feel about construction and weekends, about starting early, finishing late? Those sorts of fluid requirements are certainly a factor. Some businesses are not open on weekends and some find Saturday is their busiest day. So absolutely we'll take that into account when we're looking at again, the least disruption to those businesses possible.
Great, thank you. And just one more question, Mr. Mayor, if I could. We're taking the pathway of a closed tender process. Can you just perhaps just unpack that a little bit for us, please?
There was a discussion that was held. I don't believe we actually need to have a closed tender process. We are structuring the tender documents in such a way that the contractors who are capable of doing this work in a central city environment with a lot of traffic, a lot of pedestrians, they will be the targeted tenderers. The others will simply not meet the requirements that we have to submit the tender. So we're saving their time and money by, don't bother making the application because we're looking for expertise in these areas, communication with the public, protecting the site, minimising disruption, those sorts of things.
Yes, so I'm not sure that really sort of gets me where I want to go with this.
Can I add then? Sorry,
yep.
Through the chair. What we've found, we've been in front of the council before talking about how people aren't bidding for work, particularly open tenders, because their return on investment is not very good because they can see that there'll be a lot of competition. And this is a time when people are generally busy. So the concept of the closed tender, as Simon said, is to identify the people who can do the work and approach them so that they have more security of the likelihood of being a winner rather than going to an open tender. It just gives them more certainty, which makes them more likely to bid, which makes us more likely to get competitive bids.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And thanks, Jeff and Simon. That's all I've got. Thank you.
Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Furthermore, to the line of questioning from Councillor Hancock, the methodology that you've mentioned around the disruptions or the trying to avoid that. So we don't know at this point the expectations around two-way carriageway, one-way carriageway, or road closure. Is that correct?
That is correct. We have had discussions with contractors, with our own engineers in-house. It's a very wide street, so there is a possibility to continue one-way traffic at a minimum through the construction zone, two-way traffic where possible. If necessary, a road closure, but that would be the least desirable methodology.
Okay, thank you. And finally, on the design and the attachment 1, can I just understand, outside Briscoe's, where there's the blue hatched paving, there's a rectangle yellow, like no parking type of line. Is that, what is that depicting there?
I believe that's the bus stop.
Okay, so when the bus comes through, it's taking up the left-hand carriage lane for the period of...
That is correct. It's a drop-off only. They don't collect passengers at that point. So the bus will be stopping for a handful of seconds to let a few people off, and then will continue on its way.
Was it considered to have an indentation, bit like the parking ahead of it? No, it's not indented there. Yeah, so is that a loading zone that is indented? Is that what that's depicting?
That is an indented loading zone, correct. There is no indenture for the bus stop. I believe it was considered in an early version of the designs, but was discounted by the urban planners who thought that it would slow traffic down having a bus there, but it's once an hour, once every 40 minutes at the most. That was the decision that they made, and that was in the designs that I've been progressing.
So that was an urban design outbid a traffic engineer? Because what's the traffic engineer viewpoint on flow and access and those type of issues around that aspect?
I believe it was considered to be a traffic calming measure, having a bus stop for 10 seconds, 15 seconds while people got off and then continue on its way. I didn't believe it was a safety issue, but it hasn't been raised with me.
Okay. Is there, I guess, to extend on that a little bit further, is there other examples where this is in our city or that I can refer to outside the city, this type of initiative to put a bus stop in the middle of the roadway?
I'm not aware of, no, it hasn't come up.
Okay, thank you.
Just further to that, probably the officers haven't. I mean, a lot of the underground services, or all of the underground services, I believe, have been done, haven't they? Yeah. So we're really talking in terms of disruption, top layer, and curb and channel, and connections basically to stormwater, etc. Right. The Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Most of my questions have been answered. I've just got one following on from the questioning from Councillor Dennison, just around the bus stop. And so I understand as a traffic calming measure how that can be seen. That makes sense. If you're going to stop traffic behind a bus, they can't do anything about that. I just wondered if there had been any engagement with Horizons or the Passenger Transport Committee around looking at those bus movements, just in response to your comment that a bus is going every 40 minutes or hour, because there's about to be a rather large bus review, and they're looking at frequency, so that could impact if there's buses going through every 20 minutes. I just wondered if there'd been consideration around that, if there'd been engagement with Horizons, if different scenarios had been overlaid thinking about frequency of buses?
Sure. I haven't had that specific discussion with Horizons. I have talked to them about the bus route. It's a one-direction bus route. The alternative route actually goes down Grey and Walding Street. Potentially that could be the other route for the return bus route rather than coming down Cuba Street, but I haven't advanced that discussion with them. I can certainly raise it with them as an option, depending on the outcome of their alterations to the frequency of buses or the process.
And then just my second question would be, my view of this plan when I look at it is it seems that once completed, it's fairly, it would be fair that we could change it. We could make changes, we could tweak it. For example, if the bus routes changed or if frequency changed, there seems to be flexibility even with loading zones indented in and all sorts, that actually we could make some changes in the future relatively easily. Is that a fair assessment?
Absolutely correct, yes.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Anybody else wishing to speak? Right, we've got it. Thank you. Right, we move to the resolutions. So we have the two resolutions on screen that the council notes the concept modifications to Cuba Street and endorses the staging of some pedestrian safety initiatives to be removed from the Cuba Street scope and delivered as part of the Streets for People program for work for Rangitikei Street. That the council approves the modified Cuba Street Stage 2 project to proceed to tender. I'm happy to move that, seconded by the Deputy Mayor. And look, councillors, if I could make a couple of comments. We've been round a couple of rounds of this, and I understand people's, I suppose, interest in it. Councillor Harper and myself, and Councillor Harper especially as the portfolio lead around this, have spoken to just about the whole street several times. And initially from complaints, it's become a more positive discussion. And I think that's because we're bringing people with us. Rangitikei Street, Cuba Street intersection is a congestion area now. You just need to get, dare I say, a Briscoe's sale, and people will know what I mean. The loading zones were an issue for some of these businesses. It's a wide street, and you only need to look at the before and after photos of Upper Cuba Street to get an example of what the street could look like from what it currently is at the moment. But loading zones were important for some of those businesses, and I appreciate the officers taking the time to carefully go through some of those in detail. There has been minor parking changes, but there is a net loss of 5 car parks. It's worth saying that this area has some of the highest parking use in our central city, but it's already vibrant. It'll only get better. And we just need to look at what has happened in the other parts of Cuba Street where it can be really enhanced. A lower speed limit, which I hope officers will come to us at some stage about making the CBD 30 k's an hour. We're the last of the metros to do that, and it's worked successfully in other larger cities. It gives a really enhanced space for pedestrians and cyclists as well. And that comes with that slower speed zone, and it's been proved with the other parts of Cuba Street. The greening of the street can't be underestimated either. At the moment, it's like a piece of our runway at Palmerston North Airport. It's all tarmac. So actually greening it, I do think will have some real enhancements for people. We've just seen how the other part of Cuba Street has been used for cafes and outdoor spaces. So look, there is some more reconfiguration of parking potentially to come in Tainui Street, and I do know there's been some real collaboration with the officers and the large retailers, Briscoe's and Rebel Sport. So there's not many downsides on this, councillors. I do hope that you support it. We're bringing people with us from quite a lot of complaints initially to one of anticipation and positiveness. I'll open it up for questions. Councillor Naylor. Sorry, comments.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Thank you. I recognise that this program is something that has been approved and has had a significant amount of work around the design and a significant amount of stakeholder engagement. I think, as the Mayor rightly puts, there's not many downsides, but I think one big downside I do see in this program is the fact that the cost has blown out almost 2.5 times what we thought it was going to cost when we made the decision to proceed with it. And in reflection of our process, it's not really clear to me, there doesn't seem to be a point in the process this is becoming quite a regular occurrence. And I guess the thing I'm asking myself, at what point do we have the opportunity to reevaluate and say, now that this is costing 1.5 million rather than 620,000, is it still value for money for our ratepayers? And when we progress it and we get this far down the track, it's really hard to backtrack. But I do have some concerns when we look at the size of our capital program and we look at how much the budgets are increasing. I do think there needs to be a point at which we say, are we going to progress everything we said we were going to progress, or are we going to actually reevaluate whether that still looks like value for money for our ratepayers? I think, you know, as the Mayor pointed out, it's simply the top layer, so we are, well, I was going to say prettying it up. It's a little bit more than that, obviously, but it's 1.5 million that we could choose to progress with, but I don't see anything significantly wrong with the way it is at the moment. My preference, I guess, in coming here today would be that we're being asked to proceed to procurement, but we're also being asked next week to approve the additional budget that is required for this to progress. My preference is actually that, given how much so many of our budgets are increasing, that is something that we consider next week. And then decide, does it fit, if we can only do 2/3 of what we wanted to do with the budget, the capital program, would this be a program that would fit within that? And I guess that's a question that I don't have a strong answer for, so I won't be supporting it at this time, but certainly acknowledge the work that's been done around bringing stakeholders with us and getting some buy-in.
Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I am happy to support the recommendations today. I think there's been a lot of engagement with the street stakeholders, the community in this part of town, which has led me to a point where I'm really comfortable with the plan going forward. Councillors will recall that the report that came to us recently, which was very, very similar, was sent back largely because of engagement. There hadn't been any concept plans attached to the report, and from what we were aware, the stakeholders hadn't seen any concept plans. So to proceed to a tender process without that left quite a level of discomfort. I'm really happy with the engagement that's happened. I think that we need to remember that most of the stakeholders in this area are really supportive of the work that we're doing, and the four that have been labelled as unfavourable haven't changed their position in a year of engagement, of tweaking, of changing the plan, of considering other parking, looking at turning lanes, all sorts of factors that have been put on the table, and their position hasn't changed. So I think that we can accept that their position probably isn't going to change, and in actual fact there is a lot of support for this. The other thing I think we need to consider is that whilst we've engaged directly with these stakeholders, they're not the only stakeholders. We have got an entire community who are funding this, an entire community of people who go and have lunch there, buy coffee there, they shop in that area, they go for walks in this space, they drive through it, they cycle through it, they walk through it. Those are also our stakeholders, and we know that there's a lot of support for this part of town to be brought up to our Streets for People standard. The other thing is that we're coming off this momentum of having our first Streets for People, well, our first in recent times, Streets for People project completed around the square. We've had the arena opening, and there is a real disconnect to get these pieces linked up. And so I think that this is a really positive step in linking that connection. A quick Google that I've done of Google Maps shows that if I look at the corner of the piece where Focal Point is, for example, and look at parking outside the arena, it's 300 metres where there is a huge amount of parking a lot of the time available. And so I don't have any concerns about removing a few parks around that space. Staff are already investigating side streets and other things, but I think actually to walk 300 metres is a fairly reasonable request for most people. I accept that that's not the case for all people, and I think that we do need to look at side streets, but for most of us, I think that that's okay. The cost points that Councillor Naylor has raised, I think are very fair, but another side of that is that even if we were to just look at things like the safety improvements which are needed for this piece, stormwater, basic infrastructure renewals, a huge part of that budget would be spent anyway on that. And so if we are needing to do work in that space anyway, we may as well invest a bit more and bring that up to standard for what is expected for what streetscapes, especially in a CBD, look like these days. So I think there will be some pushback on the cost. That's a very fair point to raise. I have been really disappointed with some of the rhetoric that's coming through, particularly through the media around cost blowouts and all of these things, because what we need to remember is that some of these projects, when they first get put in a 10-year plan, some of it is actually a seed funding amount, or it's an amount that's put in that we know to the best of our knowledge in that situation, which may be appropriate for a feasibility study or investigations or looking at that point. What we need to realise is actually the state of the infrastructure sector right now is very different to what it was 12 months ago, 24 months ago, 36 months ago. So actually, we are making decisions, putting them into our budgets to the best of our knowledge. We are not, we're not putting it in there and then expecting that we come to the chamber in whatever period of time later with this so-called cost blowout. In actual fact, we are making decisions that that we know with the information we're given at the time. And so I think that actually it is reasonable to expect that when something's been in our plan for a number of years, that the cost will change because the economy has changed. So I don't have huge issues, and I've come to accept, especially with some of the things that we've been voting on lately, that this is going to happen. So I'm comfortable with standing on this decision. I'm comfortable with where the finances are, and I think actually when people see the finished project, they see the connection, particularly from the arena right down through the square, then actually there'll be a huge amount of support for this. So I'm more than happy to support this today.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for the opportunity to speak to this, and would just start off by acknowledging your comments and the extensive comments from the Deputy Mayor. I think really setting the scene well around this opportunity that is here for us. I very much in line with that thinking do see this project as a step in the right direction, although really mostly once we get that second stage delivered, going through this staging approach. Currently it is a very tired piece of infrastructure and public space, and quite a poor use of public space. I think we're going to really see a lot more value for the businesses in that area and for the users and wider community in that area relative to what we have today. So I'm quite excited about getting on with it. I must say I'm not really thrilled with the recommendation to stage it out in two ways. I'd really like to see if we could get there in a single step, but acknowledge that we've been through extensive consultation with especially affected businesses and other people with direct interest in the street, and that we've sort of come to this position where staging is sort of the thing. The reason that I'm not so excited about staging is really it's ultimately sort of a reworking sort of thing. So we're going to do some work now, and then potentially in 5 years' time we might end up pulling some of that up so that we can do a bit of reworking then, which I can only imagine will take the cost beyond what it would be if we could deliver it in a single stage. And you know, what I'd like to see us in future doing, I guess, is really making sure that we're working with the management options as well as we can in terms of especially parking availability before we actually get into the hard infrastructure costs, because that's where the big money is. So if we work with our speed limits, if we work with active demand management in parking rather than just going park as long as you like, you know, we could potentially actually be resolving some of these issues in a way that we could get there in a single stage, lower cost, more effective, realize the benefits sooner for the city. And I'd really like to see us working towards that approach in future. Parking I will comment on a bit. Yes, a number of large car parking areas off-street within easy walking distance, acknowledging that for some that is a more difficult journey. As the Mayor said, this is some of the most hotly contested real estate in terms of parking in the city, and the sooner we get away from all-day parking and not much active management of it, the better in terms of actually getting the people that want to be in there, and then moving on with their day. Certainly good to see the stakeholder consultation be very thorough, and I think others have traversed it, so I won't go too much further, but again, the vast majority, even in the street now, is really welcoming of this and wants us to move on with it, so I'll be happy to support it today and look forward to actually seeing the works happening.
Councillor Hapeta.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just want to first off say thank you to the officers for all the hard work that they have done with this project. It has been a hard project to actually go forth with. First off, in looking at the stats, 17 in favour and 4 against, so that's just raw data. And, it's good to have good consultation with these stakeholders, and that's what this project has done. These stakeholders, we have worked hard with them, and that's what this is showing. And I do think that the Deputy Mayor has gone through the cost of the project, and these projects have increased in costs, and I know that Councillor Naylor has said that we shouldn't keep increasing and saying yes to these projects, but we've seen a lot of projects that have increased in costs. So I do think that sometimes we have to suck these projects up when they have increased in costs, and we can't, we said yes to this project quite a long time ago, and now the costs have gone up, and we don't know when these costs are going to go up. So I do fully support this project. We have got a lot of people out on this street that are really looking forward to this project going ahead. It's continuity of the Cuba Street project, and this is stage 2, and it'd be really good to see it finish. And a lot of people on the street want to see it finished and want to see it finished in a good style. So I hope you do all support it, but well done to the officers for all the hard work they have done on it.
Councillor Denison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I've been very pleased with the outcome of the Stage 1 streetscape for Cuba Street, and I'd expect that the refreshment of Stage 2 would also get the results that we're after. Just a couple of minor points I did raise, and it's not going to hold me from supporting this wholeheartedly, but I just found it odd that the bus stop was in the middle of the street, and I'll mention that publicly because I raise it as, maybe it's seen as being a new initiative, but rather odd for my mind. But I do think the parking provision is one of the most important things for the success of it, because we are unknown at this stage whether the roadway will be continued, even in a one-lane capacity for access. And so therefore I want to move a third recommendation that activates that parallel parking in Tainui Street into a reconfiguration to increase the parking, just for those immediate needs while the construction takes place, if not to be retained ongoing. So that wording would be that the parallel car parks on Tainui Street be reconfigured to diagonal to increase car parking capacity, and I'll move it. Councillor Hapeta has indicated a willingness to second that and put that on the table. One of the things we had was around access and the disruption around the streetscape in the square, and we went with a one-lane carriageway, which meant that there was still some parking and access around the street, but that did mean the compromise of a longer period of construction. So I know there's a balancing in that, and I'll leave that to the tender process to work out how the methodology of that will be achieved. But for the pure balancing of need for those retailers and cafes to get some nearby parking in lieu of that, I think this recommendation is very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. If you can just give that extra, I'm not sure if that's an amendment or a motion. I didn't capture all of it. All right, extra recommendation, okay. All right, councillors, no other comments? I might just make a few comments just as in right of reply. I think, oh, sorry, Councillor Finlay, you're in the...
Just along with Councillor Dennison saying, for many years in, Manor Street and Wakefield Street in Wellington, there have been bus stops on the side of the road which close traffic, and they have always done so because the roads are so narrow. Cars are so used to it that they sit behind the buses and they wait for them. At least 50 years that's been going on for, so it doesn't cause any disruption there.
Thank you, Councillor. I was just about to comment on that. I thought it was very Melbourne-like to have some buses stopping for a short period of time, and remembering that this will be a lower speed zone. We've seen it work in the other part of Cuba Street, where the numbers of just naturally, this average speed has come down to approximately 30 kilometres. Look, I think we have to do this in a couple of stages. I don't think we're going to get there in stage one. We certainly would have some real congestion issues, and with buses stopping in the middle of the street. So I'm comfortable where we're at with this. Again, we're bringing people with us. The businesses, in terms of the parking management, which I think Councillor Barrett spoke about, the businesses and retailers are telling the officers and us that they do want some change to the all-day parking. That was great 5-6 years ago, but times have moved on, and they would like some time-controlled management of parking to do what it should do and move people around. I believe we'll finish this work, and it will really complete the street exceptionally well. I understand the cost increases, but anybody that's doing anything at the moment, you know that your costs are changing. A quote that was done 3 months ago is out of date. Do anything on your house in terms of building, and you will understand that. I think also we've missed some commentary too that this is eligible for NZTA subsidy as well. Admittedly, it's small in the 150-odd thousand mark, but that should be picked up as well. So I ask you please, councillors, we'll take these two recommendations first, and then we'll come back to Councillor Dennison's one. Ask you to vote on this, please. And it is passed, 15 votes for and 1 against. Thank you. We'll just do a couple of minutes and just wait for this extra resolution to come forward.
Mr Mayor, it seems a better way forward if every member understood the difficulty with what's been recommended, and then rather than just the mover, to understand the rationale for depending on the direction of it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Through the chair, we ask that the recommendation just be continue to investigate, because we are investigating the parallel parks at the moment, and we're particularly investigating whether we can safely do diagonal parks on both sides of the road. We can definitely do diagonal parks on one, which will push the number up. Whether we get to 25 or not, which is what we have in the report, we won't know, because we're actually looking at the whether we can do that safely. So we would ask that we're very happy to continue the investigation. There is definitely work going on for Tainui Street. It's just the number, so we haven't fully got there yet, and we'd like to continue investigating.
So back to you, Councillor Dennison. Have you got a recommendation that's coming, or are you quite happy with that reply?
Actually, I've got a question of that reply, if that's okay. In the second line of 5.4 on page 18 of our order paper, the second sentence says, the reconfiguration of car parking on Tainui Street has been investigated as an option to increase available parking, and it has been determined that 13 parks on the eastern side could be removed and replaced with 25. And then what's saying in the bottom section, in the bottom sentence, has not yet been progress pending, which I thought was the configuration of it, but I thought the review had been done and it's been determined it can happen.
The Chair, the approximately 25 was looking at it, and as we got into the detail of designing it, because there is an intention to do this through the minor roads works next year, that was when we got to the point of can we safely do, can people safely reverse out of diagonal parks on both sides of the road? So it's come up as a more detailed design issue subsequent. Definitely do it on at least one side, but how we can sort of, what the design actually looks like for safe implementation is that next level of detail.
Thank you for that additional comment. I'm happy with that, and if the second is happy to move it in that new frame to investigate that, I think it's very important that we continue to move forward with the parking provision, and if this is the way forward to investigate first, to ascertain that, and if this doesn't come out, I'll be pursuing other options because I think the access is still important for those retailers. Thank you.
Okay, I'll open this up for any comments. Councillor Johnson.
Just before we all get carried away with car parking, I just want us to remember that we're in a situation where one of our key 4 goals is to reduce carbon emissions. And a lot of our strategies are around trying to get people to reduce their car use. And I'm not really sure how continuing to maintain the same level of car parks in the centre of town is going to help us to achieve that strategy. So I understand that when we're under pressure from stakeholders about car parking, that we're trying to come up with mitigation options. But what we're talking about here is the loss of 5 car parks in that segment of Cuba Street. And I just think we're losing sight of our bigger goals here around climate change. So I'm not going to be supporting this. And going forward, I think we need to be very clear about what our goals are. If one of our main goals is to reduce carbon emissions, then we can't continually enable car use because that's just not helpful. So whilst a certain number of car parks are always going to be required for short-term use or for people with mobility issues, we've just got to get away from this sort of car-centred approach, and so I won't be supporting it.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So in addition to the points recently raised, I think, how do we achieve city centre vibrancy is the question. More on-street car parking isn't the answer. And so I'm quite reluctant to see us driving an agenda that eats up incredibly valuable space in the heart of our city to store cars. We need to be thinking about off-street parking strategies if we're going to be commissioning more investigation. And I think to the resolution specifically, we've actually heard from management they're doing this already. I don't really see any need to add further administrative load given that the work's already in progress.
Councillor Beattie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm happy to support this. I don't think there's any problem with just making sure that staff understand that we want this to be done quickly. So that's all we're saying, and they are doing it now, and we're stressing, yes, we want it done as quickly as we can. I think it is actually important that when we're in an area of real development and investment, we're a growing city, and as far as carbon emissions go, I think we've got to balance this, because I think it's really defeating the purpose if you're taking car parks out and people are going continually driving round and round and round looking for car parks, especially in an area where you know that they're needed. So I really don't see the point of that. So I think we do need to support the shops and the businesses and that around that area and make sure, and mobility, especially for mobility people with for disabilities, I think it's really important. And we've taken 5 car parks out there. We've increased that whole area with different businesses. So, I mean, we're talking about half a dozen car parks, for goodness sake. It's not like we're going to put a great big 1,000 car park building in there.
Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm not going to support this recommendation. As Councillor Johnson said, it contradicts one of our 4 city goals to be increasing the provision of car parking capacity. And I'm opposing this because I want staff to know that I don't support this and I don't want it to be done. So I think that message needs to be balanced from the way people are voting. I'll just remind elected members that if we take one step back from looking at this very small piece of roading that we're talking about, and we draw a circle around a walking distance of 3, 4, 5 minutes, there are a huge number of car parks available for people. They just have to add literally a minute, maybe 2 minutes onto their journey. We've got the example of further down Cuba Street, all around the arena, other side streets. I don't think that this is an appropriate response to 5 car parks being reduced. Additionally, the balance on looking at a reduction of carbon emissions in this ever-pressing issue of climate change is not to continue to supply or increase car parking capacity in the city. If anything, we should be looking at considering something like a sinking lid policy for our car parks, where every time we review a piece of infrastructure, roading, whatever, that actually we aim to increase the amenity value of that area and reduce the car parking available, encouraging people to make other choices. If we are spending our efforts increasing car parking capacity, I think that can be redirected into lots of other things, such as increasing the amenity, such as providing alternatives, including reduced bus fares, free buses, encouraging people to walk, looking at targeted education campaigns. I would much rather that our staff use time in that direction or resource rather than spending money reconfiguring roading to fit in additional car parks. It goes against one of our city goals. We know we have a huge road ahead with reducing our carbon emissions that we are very much under-investing in this space. And so, if anything, perhaps we could take the budget for reconfiguring car parks and put it into addressing climate action, which we are well underdone on at the moment.
Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Mr. Please forgive my inexperience and any offense if it is there. I can only support this if you add a couple of words and delete at least one word from this. So, to me, it should look like to stop investigate the reconfiguration of parking on Townley Street to keep the current parking capacity. So then, only then I can support this. On one hand, we are talking about reducing number of cars and reducing motorized traffic. On the other hand, we are encouraging people to bring their cars anyway. If they want to walk 4 minutes, they should drive their car for half an hour and bring it on Townley Street. So I can't support it. Thank you.
Councillor Finlay.
Mr. Mayor. Maybe some people would like to go down to the arena and park down there. I know a lot of older people certainly won't be. But and walking 300 metres in the rain to the pitches or whatever, maybe some younger people will. Just recently, and on Wednesday night, I went down to a meeting at Centrepoint there, and I was lucky enough to get a park in George Street. One of the other people in the meeting turned up half an hour late, and the reason being they've been driving around for half an hour looking for a park. Now, that didn't do our carbon emissions very good, did it? The lack of parking there at the moment is quite bad, and we're going to take some more parks out, and Centrepoint is getting busier and busier. Now they have a conference centre up and running there. There's going to be even more use of parks there. I support this, and I will vote for it, and I would ask the other councillors to think very carefully about what we're saying here. We're saying to businesses like Centrepoint, we don't want you in the CBD. We're not going to help you with your futures. We don't really care what you want. We'll do what we want. We have to be able to and willing to assist the businesses in the city that are trying to get up and going. Centrepoint has been a very successful new business. We should be encouraging it, not discouraging it. So I will support this.
Councillor, you mean Focal Point?
Focal Point, yes.
Yeah, thank you. I sort of... Yeah. Councillor Harpiter.
Yeah, I'm just going to follow on from Councillor Finlay. Also will support it because of Focal Point, but also just want to follow up to say that one of our goals is to keep the city vibrant, and want to make sure that we are following all our goals, not just one of our goals. And I think vibrancy in the city is really important to us, not just one of our goals that we're all going on about. So I think vibrancy is just as important as all the other goals that we've all stated today.
Councillor Dingwell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I am not going to support this because we do actually need to start taking climate action seriously, and that means not increasing our car parking, point blank. We just need to actually start doing something in that space, and this is not the right way to go. If you're looking at vibrancy in the city, if anybody has been to those creative city conversations that our council has been putting on, they will tell you that it's not about the parking. It is about making the areas vibrant, and that's what we're doing on Cuba Street. So just adding extra parking around the corners, which, by the way, is near where I live, is not going to help it. It's not going to help it. So we need to take climate action seriously, not continue creating more areas for parking, and start focusing on making the areas that we already have more vibrant, because the more people who walk around the cities, the more they have a chance to actually look at these shops that we've got and spend their money there. And we know that this happens in other areas. So it's not about not being supportive for business. It's actually about encouraging people to look at these businesses and shop there.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. A question through you for clarification, if that would be all right. So the work that's being discussed here was included operationally for background in the report and would have gone ahead on the basis of the recommendations. My question is, if this is lost, does that give direction to officers that that operational work that they were already planning would therefore not happen at all?
Could somebody just answer that?
No.
Thank you. Councillor Meehan.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd just like to add that the comments been made about parking down at Arena, and it's a couple of minute walk or a 300-metre walk. When the stock cars are on, you grab a park down there. When we have our youth sports come into town, you grab a park down at Arena. There ain't one down there. Okay? There's no parking there anywhere. So, I mean, we're talking about 5 parks. I don't think it's going to really bring anything home too much, so I'll support this.
All right, right a reply. Back to you, Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Hey, I think we're losing the point around, I don't think any one of us around this table is going to be dying the ditch with 5 less car parks. Let's get that point very clear. But this is a decision to commit to our retailers that we're going to be losing potentially 38 car parks up that Cuba Street over the period of stage 2 construction. On the southern side alone, there's 27. And what do you think the business owners are going to do that have been engaged with our stakeholder meeting, that have raised this point and had some assurance that we're going to have it in place? This gives an undertaking to say that we're committed to their businesses and the access to it with the disruption of the streetscape construction work. And so I want to emphasise the fact the cost is so minor. This recommendation is just to investigate. To action it, we've heard it's just about a black paint and some white paint and some design time. Hardly going to rock the budget. The carbon emission thing, could be just a temporary measure over the summer season while we get this work done and review again to revert back to the parallel. So if you want to make a big hot topic of it, just wait for the decisions, for the responses from those businesses once they hear that council aren't committed to putting in a few extra car parks over the spring and summer while we do this. That's a hot topic. It shows a real lack of understanding of the engagement that's gone on to this point to get this across the line. And I think you're shooting yourselves in the foot if you don't support this. Not everyone can run 100 metres and even 300 and 400 metres up the street with access issues with some of our residents. So I think it benefits everybody for the short season to at least investigate. And I urge you to kind of reconsider the climate change positions that you have and actually come. We talked about around business that we had COVID last year, and I'd hate this council to be the ones that are forcing doors to be shut for months on end because they can't get people accessing their shop for distance. So urge you, councillors, thank you.
Can I, and I see councillors wanting to ask a question. I think it's the same question I'm going to ask. If this loses, I think Councillor Bowen asked the same question. There will still be some investigation on what we're doing in Tainui Street. Is that correct? Okay, thank you. Is that the same question you wanted to ask, Councillor Johnson?
Well, kind of, because if officers are going to go ahead and investigate the parking on Tainui Street, whether this passes or fails, why are we even voting on it?
I can't answer that.
It is a very operational recommendation. And the work has already been, we've been investigating anyway during this period as part of our overall parking strategy. So this is one of the streets that's on the the strategy.
But Councillor, it's been moved and seconded, so we have to do it.
But it's a moot point, isn't it?
I can't answer that, but yeah. We will now, there's been the right of reply. Sorry, we've probably broken a bit of protocol there. We will now go into voting, please. And it's passed 9 votes for and 6 against with 1 abstention. Thank you. All right. We now move to We'll get the record out to you. Sorry, with technical hitch there. Okay, moving through to number 6, fees and charges. Confirmation following public consultation. I'll get Steve to come forward.
Councillors, good morning, Mr Mayor, councillors. This report is, I hope, relatively routine. You, at a council meeting in March, April, decided on a series of charges, and then there was a process of public consultation. That consultation period ended. What's being proposed here in the first 3 recommendations is that the one submission that was received be noted there, be received, that the fees and charges for planning be adopted as proposed with one very minor adjustment that's mentioned in the recommendation there, and that the trade waste charges as originally approved be adopted as well. And then there's a 4th recommendation that covers off some issues that were discovered following the original recommendations and resolutions of the council in relation to implementation of the leased parking arrangements that we have. And as you will have seen from the report in Appendix 4, there are a number of particular contractual arrangements, mainly with owners and others in relation to some of those sites, and we need to take a slightly different approach to what was originally proposed. So those are all encapsulated in the report, and so any questions?
All right, thank you, Steve. We do have a couple of questions. Councillor Dingwall.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Steve, for this report. I just wanted to ask about the Hancock House car park that we raised during the last Finance and Audit meeting, and just wondering why that wasn't included in the Appendix 4, or whether, I guess, to seek clarification that that is still going to be left alone.
I'm not an expert in this, but my understanding is that the resolution of the council in relation to that particular car park will be put in place, which is that it will have a period that's not charged.
Excellent. Cool. Thank you.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for the report. It's a question of detail, and again about free car parking. On page 37, which is Appendix 4, we talk about 339 Main Street, which we all know is the Harvey Norman car park. And I just noted that the comment there was due to a land covenant, we must provide 2 hours of free parking in that space, but we currently only provide 1 hour. So how is that?
Through you, Your Worship. Essentially, the obligation is between ourselves and Harvey Norman. So 2 hours was the original covenant condition. They actually wanted a shorter and quicker turnaround, so they actually agreed to reduce that to 1 hour. So higher turnover for them, so more customers. So yeah, it's by agreement with Harvey Norman.
So should that amendment not be reflected in our documentation?
Yeah, I mean, the covenant is a legal agreement we signed a while ago, so, I mean, I think, yeah, we could reflect that, but, I mean, it's still, in effect, an agreement between the two parties, so we could look at whether that needs to be formalised, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor, it's already in place and there's no change to it. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you. My question was about the gap between what we've got written down in front of us. So I absolutely understand what the current practice is that there's 60 minutes in the top car park. But in the document in front of us for council, it says that we have a land covenant where we must provide 2 hours time-limited free parking. And then we say council is providing 1 hour. So there's a gap in the paperwork. That's my question, not what about our practice is.
No, that's right. You're correct, but it currently is 60 minutes. And it will continue to be 60 minutes, so there is no change. We're just referencing the fact that the land covenant does say 120, and that we are not doing that.
Are you asking officers to change the land covenant?
No, I'm just saying what's that written down there doesn't make sense. We say there's a land covenant for 2 hours free parking. We're only doing an hour.
Yeah, but
I don't mind
there's another agreement to say an hour.
Yes.
I understand that it'll be in writing.
Yes.
I think the thing is that there's custom and practice, if you like, and to an extent in the communications with Harvey Norman, they have not raised a concern about the way in which it's being administered at the moment. So due to that custom and practice, the proposal is to continue with what we do.
Absolutely. And I'm very happy that that's been agreed with Harvey Norman and we're not breaching any covenants, but that's not what it says in the paperwork.
Okay. All right, Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for the report. To my understanding, we are changing the swimming pool inspection fee from $205 to $203, reducing $2 as a result of the public consultation. Is it really the case?
No, not quite. What we're saying is that the current fee for that swimming pool inspections is $199, and the original proposal was that it moved to $205. But we have other types of inspection fees that use exactly the same resource, the same people, and so it was an oversight that we had originally recommended 205. It should have, in fact, been 203 that we recommended. So we're suggesting that this be consistent with the other types of fees in the building area and the like.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. Now, I thought that I read somewhere in this report last night, but now I can't find it, that the the changes in the parking charges would bring an additional few $100,000 revenue. Is that correct? Or was that my imagination?
Not just these ones we're talking about, it's the whole gambit of changes that you approved back as part of a month or two back in adopting the plan, and those are in the process of being implemented.
Was that 400,000?
Approximately 400,000.
So just my question is that additional revenue tagged to anything specific, or is it just basically an additional revenue for the overall budget?
That's revenue for the overall budget that's treated in the same way as the rest of the revenue from parking.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Beattie.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Steve, just going back to that Harvey Norman thing, just to tidy that up, wouldn't it be better just to have an asterisk to say that there is now an agreement with Harvey Norman that can be changed to an hour?
I think the reality is that it's custom and practice that we're relying on there rather than any formal agreement per se. And they haven't objected to what's happening.
But it's just that if other people read the document, they look at it in a legal sense to say, yes, there's a covenant, so why is the council not going in terms of the covenant? So there should be something to say that, yes, we understand there's a covenant, but there is an agreement with Harvey Norman that's different to the covenant.
I'm not sure about any agreement or how it's got to where it is now. Presumably at the request of Harvey Norman that we have put it to 60 instead of the agreed from 2000.
So if we just put an asterisk to say, as per agreement with Harvey Norman?
I feel like it covers it off nicely, but it's, I guess, for Steve.
Anyway.
I'm of the same opinion that there should be something there. There must be a letter or an email that states this between the two organisations, and I'm with Councillor Bowen, who originally, and Councillor Beattie, that if somebody picks this up and doesn't have this conversation or knows of this conversation, they don't understand. So if we could make a note of that, and I'm getting nodding heads, so I'm sure we can do that. All right. Are there any more questions of the officers? There being none, thank you. All right, councillors, we have the 4 recommendations there. I'm going to move them, all 4 of them, and look for a seconder. Deputy Mayor, thank you. I'll open it up for any comments. It's relatively academic. All right, we will vote, please. And that has passed 16 votes for and none against. Thank you, councillors. We'll break for 15 minutes and back into the chamber after 10:45. Thank you.
Why is he writing your notes all the time? Why is he writing your notes? Oh, you're a special mate, wasn't it?
Kia ora, welcome back, councillors. We now move to number 7, which is our Representation Review 2021. We have a memo on page 39 from our Governance Manager, Hannah, and I'll ask her to speak to that. Thank you.
Morena koutou. The paper in front of you hopefully sets out the process that we now need to go through as a consequence of introducing Māori wards for the 2022 election. Representation review gets brought forward. It wouldn't have happened for another 3 years. And we do have quite a short period in which to do a good job on this. So this report really just sets out that process for you. And I have a few slides just to walk through to try and provide some clarity. The review itself does not cover whether to have Māori wards because that decision was made by this council on April the 7th. It also does not cover our electoral system, our voting system that we use. You'll remember, I believe it was September 2020, that you made a decision to retain the current voting system for the next 2 elections. What it does cover is a much wider brief. We look at how many councillors we should have sitting at this table, and also how many councillors we should or we can have within each of the Māori and the general wards, because as a consequence of creating Māori wards, you now have general wards. We also look at whether we should continue with the system of voting across the city, which traditionally we've called at-large voting, which would now be city-wide voting, or whether it's an opportunity to consider cutting the city into geographical spaces and having councillors stand in those spaces. And also whether we should, whether there are any communities that would be, whether there are communities and therefore whether to represent those communities we would be needing to look at community boards. So that's what we'll be covering in the review. As I say, it is quite a short time frame. I've created a bit of a timeline here for you that may help a little bit. At the moment, officers are talking with groups in the community to be able to provide advice for you, and that will come to this chamber on the 4th of August. At that point, councillors will be asked to make a decision, which is what we call the initial proposal, and that is the shape that we would like our representation to be in. That's the point that we then put public notice out and go out for formal consultation. That period by law has to be at least 1 month, and we will be sticking to that month simply because the timeframes are so short. Those that submit, of course, have the right to be heard, and we'll be doing that. We'll be calling an extraordinary meeting, which is one of the recommendations in the paper today, suggesting the 23rd of September to do that. After those hearings, you will then, in your ordinary council meeting, be asked to make a final proposal. That is to either agree your initial proposal or to make changes to it. You can make changes to it based on what you've heard through the submission process. That 6th of October decision then becomes your what we call a final proposal. It doesn't become final until either the appeal period is closed and no appeals were received, or if appeals or objections were received by the Commission, then the Commission takes their time to make a determination on our behalf, and we would know just in time for the October 22 election, so by April 2022. So that's the time frame we're working to, that's the process laid out there for you. Have you taken any questions?
Thank you, Hannah. There are a couple. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I do have a few questions. So, Hannah, thanks for the report. My first question is around the 4.4 principles that officers recommend be applied. I guess, in the overall vision of the review. Are they a set of principles that have been taken from somewhere in their entirety? I see some of them have got references to different acts of Parliament, but where have they come from, I suppose?
They're not. They have come from my own research. So the Act itself, all it asks us to do is to determine what is effective representation of communities of interest and what is fair representation of electors. That is the entirety of the definitions provided in the Local Electoral Act. Specifically, fair representation in the Act is what is listed there as letter A in that section.
Okay.
4.4, but outside of that, I've collated them based on the principles in the Local Government Act and the purpose of local government, and based on the general directions given by the Local Government Commission and their guidelines for representation reviews.
Okay, so it's a bespoke set of principles that you've come up with?
It is.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And then in terms of the fairness and equality of vote, with the plus or minus 10% rule between Māori and general ward ratios of member to population, is that where the issue of whether there's one or two Māori seats depends on the total number of councillors? Is that where that comes from?
No.
Okay, so could you explain that bit then?
That where equality of vote comes from, or where the number of Māori councillors
No, where the number of Māori councillors comes from.
The number
if
of
it's not
Māori
there.
councillors is determined by a calculation which is set out in the Act. In that calculation, the number of Māori members proposed is determined by the total number of members proposed at the table against the proportion of the Māori electoral population in the district. And so if you have more members at the table, total members, then the chance of having more Māori members at the table goes up proportionally.
Okay, so it's proportional to the number of members on the Māori, the number of voters on the Māori roll, is it?
Māori electoral population and also the general electoral population.
Okay, so just for like ease of numbers, if Māori electoral population was 20% and there were 10, total number of councillors were 10, then you could expect 2 Māori councillors. Is that how it works?
Yes.
Okay, so how does that tie in then with the equality of vote that you've got in 4.4a?
It doesn't.
Okay.
It's separate.
So can you explain what you mean by in 4.4a then?
Sure. So equality of vote is something which is called the plus or minus 10% rule. This is set out in the Local Electoral Act. What it says is if you are a city that, or a territorial authority that has been cut into wards, that and you're a councillor in a ward, then the number of people that you represent, the ratio of elected members to electors, shouldn't be more than 10% more than your neighbour in the next ward, or 10% less than your neighbour in the next ward.
Okay. So there is a relationship, but one is to, when you say people in the ward, are you talking about voters or population?
In this case, this is electors.
Electors, okay.
Yes.
All right.
But sorry, to just give a little bit more distinction, the Act doesn't require equality in that ratio if someone is a councillor in a general ward and someone is a councillor in a Māori ward. It's only between the Māori wards and between the general wards.
Right. Okay, thank you. The next question is about the geographical distribution, which you talked about in F, in the same thing, under access.
Yes.
So you've said that one of the things we need to consider is geographical spread. And one of the, I guess, issues at the moment is, and would also be if we just had one general ward, is that there's no way of influencing geographical spread, is there?
When we're at large, no, there's not.
And if we were to go to one or more Māori wards and one general ward, then the same thing would apply.
It would.
So if we agree to these principles, does that mean we're sort of already saying that we don't want an at-large system or a general system, one general ward system?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. No, it is not. So my intention in putting these principles up is to give a set of criteria against which we can measure each of the options available so we can see the strengths and the weaknesses of each of the options rather than just give you a pros and cons list for each option.
Okay, so we're not predetermining anything by agreeing to that?
You're not.
That's good, thank you. Now, there's a comment further on about community boards, and I wondered if we had any idea of the costs involved with community boards. And if we don't now, will that be included in the consultation?
Can I just speak with my colleague before I answer that question? When it comes to the community board question, in order to make an informed decision on whether you would institute a community board or not, you'd need to have a fair idea of the administration costs of that in particular, the remuneration costs for the members of those boards, and how you might be considering funding that. So it would certainly be a part of the advice that would come to you on the 4th of August. I haven't at this stage considered what would go in the consultation material because that option hasn't been decided yet.
Okay. I'll take that answer as is. I mean, personally, I think we need to know what the costs are before we go out to consult on it, and so does the public, to make an informed decision.
Yes.
And then just my last question is about the comms plan in 5. So in 5.1, you've talked about some specific groups that you want to focus on in the comms plan, which is fine. But I wonder if by focusing on specific groups, we might be skewing the types of feedback that we get from the consultation, and if, as well as those, obviously ensuring that those groups are consulted with, but we also need a plan for the wider population, because if we go out to consultation but we focus on a particular group, then I'm a bit concerned that the feedback we get might be skewed by that particular group.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. I think that's a fair question, Councillor. The comment in 5.1 about who I'd be talking to is specifically referring to the preliminary engagement, so not the formal consultation period. So certainly in the advice that I bring you in August, I'd be clear where that community voice is coming from, and it'll be made clear to you where that's coming from. When it comes to the consultation, absolutely it'll be citywide. It's really important because this applies to everybody.
So what you're saying is when we go out with the formal proposal decision, consultation, sorry, before the confirmation of the decision, so the second round of consultation, that will be more directed to the whole population.
That's my intention.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Just, Hannah, just on that, just following the cost of community boards, we will include, you know, the higher level stuff that sometimes gets missed around resourcing, like GMs, managers, because you know, in the last ward system, there was always a GM at wards and you know, up to 3 to 4 officers, so it's just not an administrator.
Sorry, when I use the word administration, Mr. Mayor, I did mean in general, not particular to the
and they
role
vary.
of
I mean, we've had a
administrator.
report back to Local Government New Zealand, and the costs of them vary hugely, from hundreds of thousands of dollars down to, you know, $20,000. So they do vary greatly around New Zealand. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. I've just got a few questions around the mixed model that was talked about in the last report and is mentioned in here. So I think my understanding of one of the view from some that one of the limitations in Māori wards were that if you were on the general roll, you couldn't vote for Māori seats, and vice versa. If you're on the Māori roll, you can't vote for the general seats. And can you just clarify, was the mixed system a way that people who are on the Māori roll could have the opportunity to vote for those on the general seats?
It would be, yes.
So is, if that's the case, then under the principles for review, would that component be reflected in any of these principles that are outlined?
It would certainly be reflected in B, choice of candidates.
In the what?
B, choice of candidates.
Okay. So the comment in page 44 under 3.20 about mixed systems are rare in New Zealand. Do you think that would be pre-Māori ward? Or do you I guess, is there a value? What's happened in the past, do you think there would be any value in considering that as a potential option, a mixed system, given now that there's kind of a different landscape with Māori wards?
Certainly, the comment in 320 that mixed systems are rare is not a value judgment, it's just the state of play as it is in the country at the moment. Palmerston North City is in a rarer position in that we have an at-large system, and we have been comfortable using that for several years now, which means that a mixed system which includes an at-large component is not entirely foreign to our electors in Palmerston North. So I certainly believe it's an option, but the representation review has to look at all practicable options.
Yeah. And I hear that, but in terms of what's presented for consultation or the pre-consultation work, will the mixed model be a part of that conversation?
Yes.
That you'll be seeking feedback on?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My question just related to the number of Māori elected members around the table around a comment in, I'm just trying to find it, in 3.9. Is it? We basically wanted to know what was the threshold number of councillors where we'd drop off 2 members, and I guess on the other spectrum, what would be the number that, I think for fairness, that would create a 3rd member? If that could be a, do you know that information now?
Yes.
Okay, good, I'll be interested.
So if you have 15 members around the table, general and Māori ward councillors, then if you had 15, you would have 2 Māori seats at the table. If you had 14 or any less, you would have 1 Māori seat at the table. You would need 24 seats at the table for there to be 3 Māori seats. And of course, the Act allows you to have up to 29 at the table.
Senate. To be a Senate.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Hannah. I have 2 different questions. Number 1, say if there are no appeals, would that mean that we don't need any approval or seal from the LGNZ?
Not LGNZ, but the Local Government Commission. If there are no appeals received 1 month after your final proposal, it becomes the final decision.
So we don't need there, okay.
Correct.
My second question is regarding the community boards. Say, for example, if Mayor Grant Smith wants us to make a separate community board in the Summerhill area, will those people be liable to pay more than the city residents?
When a council decides to establish a community board or community boards, it needs to, as discussed earlier, it needs to cover the costs of doing that. So the Act says that the council has to cover that cost. How the council chooses to do that would have to be decided here. And the most common way of doing that is a targeted rate to the people that live in said boundary area of that community board.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, that's a good question. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thanks, Hannah. Just a couple questions left on my list. The first one sort of relates again to that set of principles, which I think have been described now as bespoke. So are the sort of words beyond the word in bold, are we to see those as definitions or more sort of initial commentary to help us understand what we're getting at there?
I'm checking my grammar to see whether they're appropriate definitions. My intention is that they were definitions, yes.
So I guess then I'm trying to understand, for instance, around quality candidates, what the basis is around the number of seats having a direct correspondence with the quality of candidates, at the exception of all the other factors that influence the quality of candidates.
That's a good question, and it's actually stumped me, that one. I'm trying to think back to where I was heading here. Appropriate number of seats at the table to encourage quality candidates. So in some of the discussions that have already actually begun with community members, we're hearing messages of, and partly maybe some of the messaging you heard in some of the protests that came out of the Māori wards and desire for Māori wards is people wanting to, how do I phrase this? Wanting to stand and feel like standing would have a consequence, that they wouldn't just be a number or they wouldn't be forgotten. So and I don't have an opinion on whether having more or less at the moment would create more or less higher quality or lower quality candidates. I would have to go and have a look at what the data is telling us about who's standing. I think ultimately the number of candidates, as was discussed around the table in September last year, there was a consideration of diversity of candidates would be something to consider when we're talking about the number. But off the top of my head right now, I can't give you an answer as to whether quality of candidates would be determined at all by whether the number.
Thanks for
going
that.
around in circles there.
Thanks for that further comment on the origins of that. I suppose the other one that I would be interested just to have a little bit more commentary around then would be item F around access, and that again, the accessibility of an elected member, geography has some play in that, but you know, there's many other things that play into accessibility, and so where that emphasis on geography has come from.
Yeah, this one is definitely a lot more grounded in the Act. So the Local Electoral Act is still very much grounded in geography. For example, wards themselves can only exist where there is a clear geographical boundary. So there's no provision in the Act, for example, to have gender-based seats or age-based seats or anything like that. There's no provision for that in the Act. You can only have a ward based on a geographical boundary. Because of that, as a consequence, some of the arguments for wards traditionally have been that localising and having a ward means that you have access to the person that lives in your ward physically. We know in this day and age that we can get on the phone to any councillor, we can email any councillor, we can be on the Palmerston City Council website, we can have access through our 0800 number at any time of the day. So access is no longer just physically defined, but as it is in the Act, there is still a very strong focus on geography.
Great, thank you. Final question, Mr. Mayor, is just around the timeline that's up there, and you've outlined how tight it is, but just wanted to get a point of reference around the timeframes for Māori electors to join or exit the Māori electoral roll, and when that gets locked down within this timeframe?
It's already locked down. So if you are on the Māori electoral roll now, you will be a Māori elector at the 2022 election. If you are not on the Māori electoral roll now, you won't be able to join the Māori electoral roll until 2024, which is the next time that the Māori electoral roll option is open, as it stands at the moment.
Great, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
All right, finally, Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. So I did have one further question, just prompted by the question that Councillor Dennison asked around the numbers. If we were to look at a mixed system of having some at large and some ward councillors, would that have an impact on the number of Māori seats we would have? Can you only have Māori seats in the ward but not the at large? Is that correct?
Because of the numbers on our Māori electoral roll at the moment, yes, it would. A mixed system would mean one Māori seat in the Māori ward, but then also those on the Māori electoral roll would also then be voting for the candidates in the at-large section.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Good, thank you, Hannah. Very thorough. Thank you for those, the report and those answers to the questions. All right, councillors, we'll put the recommendations up, please, if we could, all three. And we have that number one, that council resolves the report titled Representation Review 2021 be received for information. 2, that council agrees the principles set out in section 4.4 of the report titled Representation Review 2021 for assessing practical options for representation arrangements to be brought to the 4th of August meeting, that council schedule a meeting for 9 a.m. 23rd of September 2021 to hear the submitters wishing to be heard on the 2021 representation review. I'm happy to move those, seconded by the Deputy Mayor. I'm not going to speak to it. I think it's been well publicised. Any other comments? There being none, we will vote, please. Thank you. That has passed 16 votes for, none against. Councillors, we have a briefing from the Regional Council and Accelerate 25 lead team. They've been waiting for some time for us, so we'll now adjourn the meeting. We'll go to the Missoula room to hear the briefing. We'll then break for lunch. We'll come back to this meeting at 1:15. All right? Thank you.